we're recording. Cool. Yeah, so long as we're okay with battery.
Beautiful. You, sir, are a technology genius.
You can repeat things you were told me. I don't want to walk away. I want to see the show, but I'll be right back.
All right, well, welcome everybody. This is Stefanie Trimble, and she's a designer, and is going to tell us why it's so hard to work with people like her. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. No. All right, hi everyone. Mine will probably be a little short, but I'll kind of get into it. I love design a lot. I studied it in school on a print basis, so it was really interesting to get into mobile because it's very different to be designing for print and saying this is how it looks and that's it, and nobody looking at your work, or having to collaborate with anybody versus mobile where it's a communication and collaboration process 100%, if not 200%. So my name is Stefanie Trimble, and I'm here because I really like design and tech and what can happen when both of those come together, primarily around making beautiful applications and websites. I work at MentorMate as the Director of Operations, so I don't do design in my day job, but I get to witness the developer and designer interactions, the good ones and the bad ones. And I'm also responsible for putting the teams together, so I get to try to figure out, what person is going to work best with what other person. If you want to hashtag me or tweet at me or talk to me, Steph Trim is my hashtag or my contact. All right, so basically, I'm going to walk you through the process of how I realized what the best way to work with a developer from a designer perspective was, and that's through a personal project of mine that I did with my boyfriend. So we decided to build an app. That's us. I'm the designer, he's the developer, and he had this idea, and he said, let's build an app, and I said, I'd love to make it pretty because I would hate for you to launch a really ugly app. So that was the start. This was OccamScan, and this is, keep in mind, I had never designed for mobile in the past, so this is real interesting for me, very different. And yes, that is a little more, but lemur. And the logo too, so there's different aspects to it. It's not just the screens and the logo was important to branding, all of that, so I tried to do some of that. And again, remember it was an iterative process, so it really sucked at the beginning. It was awful, and we just kind of went with it. We used Draw to design the app. You don't need fancy tools. We got into fancy tools. I did have Illustrator and all of that, but just to kind of give you an idea of the iterative process, this is kind of what we started out with. And then we kind of visualized it, how that would look on a screen, obviously with not really how it would, but just to give us a better idea and understanding. And that's kind of the development of it. So it progressed from the design like this to how it actually looked on screen. It was a lot of fun to see those designs come to life. We then transitioned into a more detailed, so after a couple of iterations of this design process, there was a little bit of details lacking in what I was providing the developer. And so we dove into it a little bit, giving options, and this screen in particular was interesting because it became a conversation of how we want to design for that screen and how we want it to work, so there was different options and things that we talked through. Another iteration of that was getting into more specifics, like actual color codes and the padding, and again, from my perspective, I had never done this before, so I didn't know it was important for a developer. And I think often when you're working with designers, some of them might not come from that background, so it helps for us as a designer to know what you guys need as developers to get it done. And this is what it looks like now. So you can see that it kind of progressed from looking ridiculous to looking much better. And this is live in the app stores right now, so it's a lot of fun to see it come to life through the process. So I think it's important to go through kind of and talk about what the differences are between developers and designers. And I guess what I learned about us and what makes us different and also the same. So to start with a designer, these are the things we care about. So fonts, spaces and lines, and making sure that it's the right font. So is this lobster? The story behind this is, we were sitting down and I had told the developer, okay, use lobster for the font. And I looked at the screen and it wasn't lobster. And so he was like, give me the web app font or whatever you're going to, I don't know what it's called, but
Give me the specific font, I need the file, I need the link, all of that. So that was a learning process. So this stuff matters to us, and we can tell the difference when the wrong font is being used. Obviously, don't ever use Comic Sans, please. I think we all know that already. The other thing we care about is colors, so visual appeal, having it be the right color specifically, and again, for us as a designer, we need to be able to provide that, of course, something I learned. And lastly, spacing and padding, so making sure that it's clean and that it's correct. So you don't want to drive a designer insane by, making padding up or having just different spacing from what the design is visually. That will create that tension. The other thing is experience matters. So the transition, the layout, how everything is architected, and then waiting. The performance does matter to the designer as well, because that's part of the experience as well. So one piece that's really important that's hard from a designer's perspective is needing to see what it looks like before you can really make sure it's absolutely final and great. So I think that I'll get into how we made that happen, but this is just something to keep in mind. And then the other piece of it is needing everything before being able to start. So as a designer, you want to research, you want to see what other people are doing, you want to try different types of screens and designs and whatnot. And so from a developer's perspective, you need everything right up front before you can even start. And so that's something that was also a challenge. And then also things like, we'll just add a gray line there, and the developer would come back and say, well, what size, what color? As a designer, like the other ones, because it's consistent. And so being able to give that specific detail to the developer is important. All right, so the developer, from a designer's perspective, of course. So there's things that they care about, speed and time. So they want to be able to implement quickly, not have to spend a lot of time to develop, things that are not difficult per se, but just whatever is fastest to get something out into the market is what they care about. And second is performance, so just making sure that their application is performant and efficient, following standard guidelines, etc. So things that, to be specific about is the language, the fonts, the colors, the pixels, like the gray line example. And just note that they also care about design. It's not that they don't care what your application looks like, or that they're not purposefully changing your designs. You need to understand that they're making those changes because there's a reason behind it, whether architecturally or whether the framework they're using doesn't allow for it or whatnot. Make sure that you're designing for best practices from a designer perspective, making sure that it matches the platform, so you don't want to use the Android features for iOS. And then obviously, Material has a very specific design framework that you can use, and I think this has really helped developers and designers move in the right direction. This really helped for me, at least, when we redesigned it. The transition to the newest designs was based off of this, and it allowed us to both speak the same language or talk about the same things, per se. And then patterns. I know developers said not to use this word, but I will use patterns. The way I describe this is, for example, if they're using CSS and HTML and they are categorizing things like all headers should look like this. This is something that as a print designer you don't really think about. So it was interesting to put this together and I guess start thinking about the rationale behind why you're designing it a certain way and tying it up to the bigger, the code behind it, I guess. And so ultimately we survived, and it was fine. It was a big struggle at the beginning. There was a lot of fights, but we made it through. So here's a few tips and tricks based on what I learned along the way, how you can work better. So dearest developer, number one is choice. So it really helps if you explain to the designer why you have such complexities and constraints. So it's really different when a developer says, well, I don't want to do that, or that doesn't make sense. But being able to teach the designer about why it is that you can't do that, and obviously also for the designer to learn and kind of seek out that knowledge as well. But allowing the designer to choose and be able to say, okay, well, if this is hard, well, what about this? Versus, well, we're not going to do it that way. Number two is collaboration. So Collaborating on features and functionality is fun, so please do include the designers in that. It's a lot better when it's a collaborative process and you're coming up with these ideas together versus just being fed, this is how it's supposed to look, or this is how it's supposed to work. So the collaboration piece is huge. And number 3, patience. So I think you guys are extremely patient for working with designers. I can definitely see that now. But we do care a lot about how things look, so when things don't turn out the way we envisioned them, it's very difficult to swallow and change. So thank you for that patience. The most direct path to a designer's heart is to care about the details. So I think that speaks for itself. Dearest designers, what I learned is that consistency, so making sure that you keep your designs consistent, that they make sense from a code perspective, and using style guides so that we're both talking about the same thing, so it's not, completely random when you guys are implementing the designs. Secondly is compromising. So I understand, after a few revisions, I understood that, maybe we might want to design something differently because it's going to take 5 hours versus 100. And knowing that will open up the designer's, mind and willingness to compromise. And number 3 is be specific. So again, being able to provide the color codes and the fonts and the pixels and the specifics will really help, because what I noticed was that visually they might see the same design, but to them they don't see it as important, the padding, and to a designer it's like life or death. So if it's something that you care about, then write it down and be specific about what you want. So a couple things that we did, this is what really made it work, was the tools. We basically lived on Drive, so we had folder structures, and obviously it makes sense of that, because sometimes I would put the designs in the app screen designs versus the design folder versus like the color folder versus, so just having some sort of structure and really sticking to that really helps. It just facilitates things. It sounds silly, but it's a huge deal. And this is kind of the workflow that we implemented and started doing now, and this works great. So step 1 is just ideating and coming together and really thinking about, what features do we want, what functionality, what vibe are we going for, anything like that. And then once we decide on those, then we split up. And so the designer would go off and design and come up with ideas and do research, and then the developer would go away and code and start, building the basic structure and house of whatever you're building. And then after that, it would get fed into the developer to implement the designs, and then we would collaborate. So we would sit down, we would review and say, okay, well, literally like next to each other, we would sit down while he coded and change things live for the designer to visually see how it's changing and what you really mean, so that the designer can immediately say, no, that's not the line color I mean. So that instant gratification of that change really, really helped to make this go so much faster than having to wait for designs and then, no, that's not what I designed, and then going back and forth. So that really helped. This is where the final designs kind of came from, and it was basically laying out all of the screens and then talking about those screens and tweaking them accordingly, right? I mean, there's still obviously wiggle room and things that I as a designer hadn't considered. Spacing like long names and what happens to, how do you shrink that, or the one big thing is that style guide, right? So providing those guidelines with the specific details and when you're supposed to use what color and what font size and whatnot. I mean, it's pretty basic, but it's very important and huge. And once it got me thinking in that way, it was a lot easier and a lot quicker for the developer to implement as well. And this is really it. It's all about collaboration and communicating more and focusing on how to work together versus working separately. I think the iterative process was the biggest aha moment for me as a designer, and I highly recommend it. That's it. Super quick. Do you guys have any questions for me?
Do you have any file naming conventions you
For
need
the designs or
for both, so both can?
Not really. I mean, we did for the design screens revisions, we had the dates on them, versions on them, but that's really it. A lot of the design process was actually done that side by side next to each other, where we would take a basic design and then iterate on it live as the developer would code, and as I would tell the developer, give them feedback.
How do you tackle a style guide when you have 2 or more platforms that you have to develop for?
Either by having 2 style guides or still using the same one and leaving it up to the developer to kind of guide you that way. I don't think a lot of the style guide, at least the limited version style guide that I did, would have changed between platforms. Yeah.
Are there any methods that you could recommend about teaching designers like platform standards or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just the designer, they need to have the initiative to want to learn about how the platforms actually work. For me, it was just sitting next to the developer and the developer telling me, well, what you're trying to do doesn't work or isn't standard for this platform, and that's how I would just learn. So, the more of that you do, the more you'll learn. But I went to the material design style guides and just learned up and read, and that changed completely, entirely how I was designing.
It's a really good idea, really good for developers to be able to see that, not have to fish around for it themselves.
Absolutely.
To your question, I think you could use like normalized.css. Have you heard of that? Oh, it makes a CSS the same across all platforms. You just gotta put it in your folder.
I should probably back up and say, this was a little interesting because we were using Cordova as the development language, or the platform, if you will, so it was a lot of web development versus straight up Android, so it's not, we had the flexibility to really design however the heck we wanted, because we're using HTML, CSS, and Angular, and not Objective-C and whatnot, so Java. Cool. Thank you, guys. Sorry it was so short.
Be sure to give your feedback on the DevFest app on the Play Store.